Welcome to Mr. Horror. Get ready to be spooked as we bring you some bone-chilling tales of true creepy cemetery horror stories. Cemeteries are eerie places, and sometimes things happen there that are hard to explain. One cemetery in particular had a reputation for being haunted. The headstones were old and worn, some even tilted at odd angles. It was rumored that if you visited this cemetery at night, you could hear strange noises and see apparitions. One night, a group of teenagers decided to explore the cemetery. They were looking for a thrill and thought it would be fun to scare each other with ghost stories. As they wandered deeper into the graveyard, they heard a sound that made their blood run cold. It was a low, mournful moan coming from somewhere in the darkness. The teenagers froze, unsure of what to do. The sound grew louder, and they realized it was coming from a freshly dug grave. As they approached, they saw that the dirt had been disturbed, as if something had been trying to claw its way out. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the hole. It was a woman, pale and gaunt, with dark circles under her eyes. She staggered towards them, arms outstretched. The teenagers screamed and ran, but the woman followed them, her moans growing louder. As they reached the cemetery gates, the woman disappeared, as if she had never been there at all. The teenagers were shaken and confused, unsure of what they had just witnessed. They later learned that the woman had been buried alive by mistake and had suffocated in the coffin. From that day on, the teenagers never visited the cemetery again. They couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched and that the woman's spirit was still lingering among the headstones. The experience had taught them that sometimes the scariest stories are the ones that turn out to be true. As a cemetery caretaker, I thought I had seen it all. But one night, as I was closing up, I heard a strange noise coming from one of the tombs. At first, I brushed it off as the wind or an animal, but the noise persisted. I cautiously approached the tomb and heard what sounded like faint whispering. I could barely make out the words, but it sounded like someone was chanting in a language I didn't recognize. My heart raced as I quickly locked up and left for the night. The next day, I decided to investigate further. I asked around the town, but no one had any information about the tomb or its occupants. I decided to do some research and found that the tomb belonged to a family who had lived in the area over 100 years ago. According to legend, the family had been involved in the occult and had performed dark rituals in the cemetery. The whispers I had heard could have been the spirits of the family members, still trapped in the tomb and seeking to communicate with the living. The following night, I returned to the cemetery with some equipment to try and capture any paranormal activity. As I approached the tomb, I felt a cold chill run down my spine. The whispers had grown louder, and I could hear distinct words now. I set up my equipment and began to record. Suddenly, the whispers turned into a loud, guttural growl, and I felt an intense pressure on my chest. I couldn't breathe and stumbled backward, falling onto the ground. The growling intensified, and I could see dark shadows moving inside the tomb. In a panic, I scrambled to my feet and ran out of the cemetery. I didn't stop until I was miles away. I knew I couldn't return to the cemetery alone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to go back and confront whatever was inside the tomb. After a few days of mustering up the courage, I returned to the cemetery with a group of paranormal investigators. We set up our equipment and began to investigate the tomb. We heard the whispers again, but this time we were able to make out some of the words. They were in a language none of us understood, but we could sense the darkness and malevolence behind them. Suddenly, one of the investigators was thrown across the room, and we heard a loud, demonic laugh. We were all frozen with fear, not knowing what to do. But then one of the investigators began to recite a prayer, and the whispers grew fainter. We continued to recite the prayer, and eventually the tomb fell silent. We left the cemetery shaken but relieved that we had finally put the spirits of the dark family to rest. I never returned to the cemetery at night again and resigned from my job shortly after. As a teenager, I used to work part-time at a cemetery to earn some extra money. It was a quiet job, mostly involving landscaping and maintenance work. However, one night, something strange happened that still haunts me to this day. It was a warm summer night, and I was the only one working in the cemetery. I was raking some leaves when I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. I turned around but didn't see anyone. I shrugged it off, assuming it was just an animal, and went back to my work. But then the sound of footsteps grew louder and more distinct. I turned around again, and this time I saw a figure standing in the shadows. It was a tall man wearing a black suit and a top hat, and he was staring directly at me. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I could feel his eyes piercing through me. I froze, unable to move or speak. After a few moments, the figure slowly turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. After that night, I was always uneasy working in the cemetery, but I tried my best to ignore it. However, a few weeks later, I had another terrifying experience. It was another late-night shift, and I was walking down a path between two rows of graves. Suddenly, I heard a faint whispering sound coming from behind me. I turned around, but again, I didn't see anyone. I continued walking, and the whispering sound grew louder and more persistent. As I approached one particular grave, the whispering sound became clearer, and I realized that it was the voice of a woman. She was speaking in a language I didn't understand, and her voice was cold and eerie. I couldn't see anyone, but I could feel a presence around me. I started to run, and as I glanced back, I saw the figure of a woman in a white dress standing near the grave where the voice was coming from. She had long black hair and was staring straight at me with glowing red eyes. After that incident, I quit my job at the cemetery and never returned. However, the memories of those creepy experiences still haunt me. Years later, I met a friend who was a paranormal investigator, and I told him about my experiences at the cemetery. He agreed to investigate the cemetery with me, and we went back to the place one night. As we were walking around with our equipment, we heard a loud noise coming from one of the graves. We walked closer to the grave, and suddenly we saw the figure of the woman in the white dress standing in front of us. Her eyes were still glowing red, and she let out a blood-curdling scream. We ran as fast as we could, but the figure followed us, and we could hear her footsteps behind us. We finally reached the cemetery gates and quickly locked them behind us. To this day, I don't know what was causing those strange occurrences in the cemetery, but I never want to go back there again. Thanks for tuning into this true creepy cemetery horror stories. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel for more scary horror stories. Don't forget to hit the bell icon to be notified when we upload new content. And as always, stay spooky.